You are just a housewife, my husband Daniel Collins said with a polite smile, the kind of smile people use when they want to make something sound harmless. The ballroom was glowing with soft gold lights, crystal glasses clinking, a string quartet playing somewhere near the tall windows that overlooked the river. It was the annual Hospital Foundation Gala. The kind of event where people in tailored suits shook hands over million-dollar donations and spoke in careful, measured voices. I had spent the afternoon getting ready. I chose my navy dress, the one that still fit well after all these years. I pinned my hair back the way Daniel used to say he liked. 43 years of marriage teaches you small habits like that. I stood beside him as he greeted the evening's most important guest, a tall silver-haired man named Richard Bennett, the largest donor the hospital had ever received. Cameras flashed. People leaned closer to hear their conversation. Daniel gestured toward me as if remembering I was still standing there. "This is Margaret," he said casually. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, "She's just a housewife." The words landed softly, but I felt them settle in the air between us. Just a housewife. I smiled. I have learned that silence can hold more dignity than any argument. Richard Bennett shook Daniel's hand, but his eyes shifted to me and stayed there longer than expected. Not the polite glance strangers usually give. This was different. Careful. Searching. For a moment I wondered if I had spilled something on my dress. I glanced down at the smooth fabric. Nothing. The music drifted through the room. Waiters passed with trays of sparkling water and small plates of salmon. Conversations continued around us, but I could still feel Richard's attention, steady and curious. "Have we met before?" he asked gently. Daniel laughed before I could answer. "Margaret doesn't get out much," he said. "She prefers the quiet life." Again that same pleasant smile. The one that wrapped his words in something polite enough that no one would question them. I nodded slightly, playing my part. But Richard didn't laugh. His gaze stayed fixed on my face, as if he were trying to place a memory that refused to come into focus. After a moment I said something simple, the kind of polite conversation you make at events like this. "My maiden name was Hayes," I said. The moment the word left my mouth, everything changed. Richard's expression froze. The color drained from his face so quickly it startled me. The room seemed to pause, the music drifting somewhere far away. Then slowly he stepped forward. Before anyone could react, he reached out and wrapped his arms around me in a sudden, stunned embrace. His voice, low but unmistakably clear, trembled beside my ear. "Margaret Hayes," he whispered. "My God. I never married." For a moment I did not move. Richard Bennett was still holding me as if time had folded back on itself, and the quiet around us began to spread through the ballroom like a ripple in water. Conversations slowed. Glasses paused halfway to lips. I stepped back gently, trying to understand what had just happened. Richard was still staring at me with the kind of disbelief people have when they open a door and find their entire past standing on the other side. Daniel's hand suddenly closed around my elbow, firm but controlled, the way someone steadies a situation before it becomes uncomfortable. "Richard," Daniel said with a light laugh, "you must be mistaken. My wife has lived in Chicago for decades." His voice sounded calm, but I felt the tension in his grip. Richard did not answer him right away. His eyes never left my face. "Margaret Hayes," he repeated slowly, as if testing the name against a memory he had carried for years. "You lived on Willow Street. White house with the maple tree in the front yard." The image appeared in my mind instantly. The narrow porch. The chipped railing my father always promised to repaint. The smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen window on Sunday mornings. I felt my chest tighten. "Yes," I said quietly. Daniel's fingers tightened slightly, but Richard stepped closer again, confusion and wonder written across his face. 40 years ago you vanished," he said. "No letters. No calls. Your parents told people you moved away suddenly. I thought something terrible must have happened." Daniel shifted beside me. "Margaret prefers not to revisit old neighborhoods," he said smoothly. "We all move on." But Richard did not look convinced. His gaze moved briefly toward Daniel, then back to me, as if he were comparing two versions of the same story and realizing they did not match. "You were supposed to meet me the night before I left for Boston," he continued gently. You remember that diner on Elm Avenue? You never came. The memory struck me like a quiet echo. The small red booth. The rain tapping the windows that night. The promise I had almost kept. I had not thought about that evening in years. I glanced at Daniel. He was smiling again, the same practiced smile he used in photographs and business meetings. Richard, he said. This is a charity gala, not a high school reunion. A few people nearby chuckled politely, but Richard did not join them. Instead he said something that made the air around us feel suddenly heavier. That is strange, he said slowly, looking at Daniel. Because I spoke with you once many years ago. You told me Margaret had chosen a different life, and did not want anyone from her past contacting her again. My heart skipped. I turned toward my husband. Daniel's expression did not change, but for the first time that evening I noticed something behind his calm surface. A brief flicker. Something careful. Something guarded. Richard's voice softened when he spoke again. Margaret, he said quietly, did you really say that? I did not answer him right away. The music in the ballroom continued, soft and distant, but it felt as if the sound could not quite reach the space between the three of us. Richard Bennett was watching me with quiet patience, the kind that comes from someone who has carried a question for many years. Daniel was still holding my elbow, though his hand had become very still. I looked at my husband first. Daniel, I said calmly, did you speak to Richard years ago? His smile remained, polished and careful, the same expression he used when speaking to reporters or hospital board members. Margaret, this is not the time for old stories, he replied lightly. People are watching. That part was true. Several guests nearby had begun to notice the tension in our corner of the ballroom. Conversations had slowed. The string quartet continued playing, but more than one person had turned their head toward us with quiet curiosity. Richard did not seem concerned about the attention. He kept his voice gentle when he spoke again. I remember the phone call clearly, he said. Your husband told me you had moved on. He said you wanted a quiet life and that you preferred not to hear from anyone who knew you before Chicago. My chest felt tight as the words settled in my mind. I had never asked Daniel to say such a thing. In fact, I had never even known Richard had tried to reach me. I turned slowly toward Daniel. Is that true? I asked. His fingers finally released my arm, but he did not step away. Margaret, he said softly, lowering his voice as if this were simply a private misunderstanding between spouses, you have always said you enjoy peace. I thought it was best to leave the past where it belongs. The sentence sounded reasonable, calm, thoughtful, but something about it felt incomplete, like a photograph with the edges trimmed away. Richard watched both of us carefully. That is not what you told me, he said. You said Margaret did not want anyone from Willow Street contacting her again. You were very clear about it. Daniel exhaled quietly, as though this conversation had become unnecessarily complicated. 40 years is a long time, he replied. Memories shift. I stood there for a moment, looking at the two men who seemed to hold two entirely different versions of the same history. One version said I had chosen to disappear. The other suggested someone else had made that decision for me. A memory stirred slowly in the back of my mind. The night before I was supposed to meet Richard at that diner on Elm Avenue. The rain had been falling steadily against the kitchen windows. Daniel had arrived at my parents' house unexpectedly that evening, carrying a bouquet of white lilies and speaking with an urgency I had never seen before. He told me that Chicago offered opportunities one would never find in our small town. He said a fresh start would change everything. I remember hesitating. I remember asking if I should call someone before leaving. Daniel had shaken his head gently and said, "The future is waiting. Do not look backward." At the time it sounded romantic, brave. Now, standing in the bright ballroom decades later, the memory felt different. Richard's voice broke through my thoughts again, quiet but steady. "Margaret," he said, "I tried to find you for years." I looked at Daniel once more. His expression had not changed, but I could see now how carefully he was watching me. If he was measuring what I might say next. And suddenly I realized something simple, something that had never occurred to me before tonight. I had always believed that I chose my life, but perhaps the truth was more complicated than that. Richard's words stayed in the air long after he finished speaking. I could feel the quiet weight of them pressing against the years of my life like a door that had just begun to open. Around us the gala continued, glasses clinking, soft laughter drifting through the room, but the world felt strangely distant. I looked at Daniel again, and for the first time in a very long time I studied his face the way one studies a stranger. Careful, curious, as if I were trying to understand someone I thought I already knew. You told him that I did not want anyone from Willow Street to contact me? I asked calmly. Daniel gave a small shrug. The movement relaxed enough that anyone watching might think this was nothing more than a minor misunderstanding. Margaret, he said gently, that was decades ago. People grow. They change. I simply believed you deserved a clean start. A clean start. The phrase sounded familiar. I had heard it before, though I had never questioned it. Back then I was 24 years old, standing in my parents' kitchen with a suitcase by the door, and a man beside me who promised the world was bigger than our quiet town. Daniel had spoken with confidence that night, telling me Chicago was filled with possibilities. He said life moved faster there, brighter, that the past could hold people back if they allowed it. I remember believing him. Richard shifted slightly beside us, his expression thoughtful but steady. You did not disappear from the world, he said quietly. You disappeared from everyone who knew you. The sentence was simple, but it landed with a clarity that made my chest feel suddenly tight. I tried to remember the weeks after Daniel and I moved to Chicago. Everything had happened quickly. A new apartment, new neighbors, a new routine. Daniel had taken a position with a medical supply company that seemed to demand all of his attention. He worked long hours. I spent my days learning the streets of a city that felt enormous compared to the town I had left behind. Somewhere in those early years the letters from home stopped arriving. I had always assumed people simply moved on with their lives the way I had been told to do. Margaret, Richard said again, his voice softer now, I went to your parents' house many times. They always told me you had chosen a different path, and did not want anyone contacting you. But the way they said it, he paused, searching for the right words. It never felt like your voice speaking. Daniel let out a small breath that sounded almost like a quiet laugh. Richard, you are turning a simple story into something mysterious, he said. Margaret built a peaceful life in Chicago. That was her choice. I noticed how carefully he said the word choice, as if repeating it often enough might make it true. I folded my hands together in front of me, feeling the smooth fabric of my navy dress between my fingers. For 43 years I had believed my life had unfolded exactly the way it was meant to. I believed I had stepped forward into the future with confidence and certainty. Yet now, standing under the warm lights of that ballroom, a different possibility was beginning to take shape in my mind. What if the story I had been telling myself all these years had been carefully guided from the beginning? I looked at Richard again. You tried to find me for years? I asked. He nodded slowly. Yes, he said. Until your husband convinced me, you had chosen to leave the past behind forever. I turned back to Daniel, and for the first time since the evening began, I noticed something in his eyes that had not been there before. Not anger, not fear, something quieter, something calculating. And in that moment I realized a question had been waiting 40 years to be asked. The question formed quietly in my mind, but once it appeared, it refused to disappear. For decades I had believed that life simply unfolded the way it did. People met. People married. Cities changed us. Time moved forward. That was the story I had always accepted. Yet now, standing in the bright ballroom with two men from two different chapters of my life looking at me, the edges of that story were beginning to shift. I looked directly at Daniel. Why did you tell people that I did not want anyone from my past to find me? I asked calmly. My voice was steady, but inside I could feel years of quiet assumptions beginning to rearrange themselves. Daniel's expression remained composed. If anyone else had been watching closely, they might have thought this was nothing more than a husband and wife discussing an old misunderstanding. Margaret, he said gently, you are looking for complications where there are none. We were young. We moved forward. I believed it was best not to keep reopening doors that belonged to another life. His answer sounded thoughtful, even protective. It was the kind of explanation that could easily settle a conversation. But tonight something about it felt incomplete. Richard Bennett was still standing beside us, listening carefully. "You did not sound uncertain when you spoke to me," he said quietly. "You sounded very sure." Daniel turned slightly toward him with the calm patience he often used during business negotiations. "People remember conversations differently after 40 years, he replied. "I am sure you can understand that." Richard held his gaze for a moment, then slowly shook his head. "No," he said. "Some moments stay clear forever." I felt my heartbeat slow as another memory began to surface, something small I had never questioned before. The first Christmas Daniel and I spent in Chicago. I had asked if we should send holiday cards to my parents' old neighbors or the friends I grew up with. Daniel had smiled and said that big cities work differently. People built new circles there. It was better not to carry the past everywhere we went. At the time it sounded practical, sensible. Now the memory felt strangely deliberate. "Margaret," Richard said gently, bringing me back to the present, "did you know I wrote letters for years?" I turned toward him surprised. "Letters?" He nodded. "Every few months. I sent them to your parents' house because that was the only address I had." I felt a quiet chill run through me. "I never received any letters," I said softly. Richard's expression grew thoughtful again. "That is what your husband told me," he said. "He said you had read them and asked him to make sure I stopped writing." The words settled slowly into the silence around us. I looked at Daniel. He did not immediately respond. Instead he straightened his jacket slightly, a small gesture that seemed almost automatic. "Margaret," he said calmly, "your parents were worried about you at the time. They believed too many connections to the past would make it harder for you to adjust to your new life. I was simply trying to respect their wishes." I listened carefully to the way he explained it. Respecting wishes, protecting peace, encouraging a fresh start. Every phrase sounded reasonable, but when I placed them together, they formed a pattern I had never noticed before. Richard spoke again, his voice softer now. "When the letters started coming back unopened, I assumed you had moved on," he said. "So eventually I stopped writing." I stood there quietly, letting the weight of that sentence settle inside me. 40 years of silence. 40 years of a story I had accepted without question. And now, piece by piece, the silence was beginning to speak. I stood quietly as the meaning of Richard's words continued to unfold in my mind. The ballroom still shimmered with light and music, but inside me something had become very still. Letters. 4 years he had written letters. And somehow every one of them had disappeared before they ever reached me. I tried to picture those envelopes arriving at my parents' small white house on Willow Street. The narrow mailbox beside the porch. My mother collecting the mail each afternoon the way she always had. The image felt clear and familiar, yet suddenly the story behind it no longer made sense. "You said the letters came back unopened?" I asked Richard slowly. He nodded. "After a few years they were returned with a simple stamp across the front. Returned to sender. No explanation." I felt a strange chill move through my chest. I turned toward Daniel again. "Did you know about the letters?" I asked calmly. He did not answer immediately. Instead he glanced around the ballroom as if measuring how many people might still be paying attention. Then he leaned slightly closer to me, lowering his voice. "Margaret, we are standing in the middle of a public event," he said softly. "This conversation does not need an audience." The answer was careful, but it was not a denial. Richard noticed it too. "That was not the question," he said quietly. Daniel's eyes moved toward him again. And for the first time that evening I noticed a faint tension behind his calm expression. 40 years ago we were all young," Daniel said. "People make decisions quickly at that age. Sometimes those decisions are misunderstood later." I listened to his words, but something about them felt distant, like a familiar song played at the wrong speed. My mind kept returning to small details I had ignored for decades. The way Daniel always insisted we move to a new apartment every few years during the early part of our marriage. The way he gently discouraged me whenever I mentioned visiting my hometown. The way he set travel schedules and business responsibilities made it complicated. At the time I had accepted those explanations without question. Now they felt different. "Margaret," Richard said carefully, "when I stopped writing I believed you had chosen a new life. I never imagined you might not even know the letters existed." His voice carried no accusation, only quiet surprise. I folded my hands together again, feeling the steady rhythm of my breathing. For many years I had described my life as peaceful, predictable, safe. Yet standing here tonight, I was beginning to understand that peace built on missing pieces is not always what it appears to be. I looked directly at Daniel once more. "If the letters were returned unopened," I said slowly, "then someone made sure I never saw them." Daniel met my gaze, his expression controlled and thoughtful. For a brief moment neither of us spoke. The music drifted through the ballroom again, a soft violin melody echoing under the tall ceiling. Finally Daniel straightened his jacket and exhaled quietly. "Margaret," he said, choosing each word with careful precision, "there are moments in life when protecting someone means guiding them away from things that might pull them backward." I felt the sentence settle in the air between us. Protecting someone, guiding them away. The explanation sounded noble, almost generous. But as I stood there listening to it, a simple realization began to take shape in my mind. For 43 years I had believed my life moved forward naturally, one decision leading calmly into the next. Yet tonight I was beginning to see another possibility. Perhaps someone had been guiding that path all along. And perhaps the direction had never truly been mine. Daniel's words lingered in the quiet space between us. Protecting someone means guiding them away. I repeated the sentence silently in my mind, turning it slowly like a small object whose shape I had never fully examined before. For most of my life I had trusted Daniel's sense of direction. He was always the one who spoke with certainty about the future. He knew which opportunities were worth taking, and which roads were better left unexplored. I had believed that confidence meant wisdom. Now I was beginning to wonder if confidence sometimes simply meant control. Richard stood beside us, watching carefully but saying nothing for a moment. His expression was thoughtful, as if he understood that the most important part of this conversation was not the words being spoken but the silence that followed them. I looked around the ballroom briefly. The gala continued as though nothing unusual had happened. Waiters moved through the crowd carrying trays of sparkling water and small plates of appetizers. The string quartet had shifted to a slower melody that echoed gently beneath the high ceiling. People were laughing at tables across the room, discussing donations and upcoming hospital projects. Life moved forward exactly as it always does. Yet inside my mind something had shifted so completely that the world felt slightly unfamiliar. I turned back to Daniel. "Guiding someone away from the past," I said slowly, repeating his words, "is not the same as removing their choices." His expression remained composed, but I noticed the brief pause before he responded. "Margaret," he said calmly, "you are interpreting old events through the lens of the present. At the time we were building a life together, I believed it was important that we focused on what lay ahead." The explanation sounded logical, responsible, the kind of reasoning people often admire. But something about it no longer satisfied the question forming in my mind. Richard spoke quietly then, his voice steady and thoughtful. "Did Margaret ever tell you she wanted to disappear from everyone who knew her?" he asked Daniel. Daniel looked at him directly. "She did not need to say it," he replied. "Some things are obvious when you truly understand someone." I felt the words settle in my chest like a quiet echo. For 43 years I had believed Daniel understood me better than anyone else. He knew when I needed encouragement and when I needed calm. He knew which conversations I avoided and which memories made me quiet. Yet standing here tonight I realized something simple and unsettling. Understanding someone is not the same as speaking for them. I took a slow breath, feeling the cool air of the ballroom against my skin. "I do not remember asking you to speak for me," I said gently. Daniel's gaze remained steady, but there was a new stillness in his posture. Richard did not interrupt. He simply watched, his expression patient, as if he had been waiting a long time for this moment to unfold. Another memory surfaced quietly in my mind then. The early years of our marriage when Daniel handled every phone call from unfamiliar numbers. He used to say that telemarketers were relentless in a city like Chicago. He said it was easier if he filtered those interruptions himself. At the time I had been grateful for the help. Now the memory felt strangely precise. I looked at Daniel again. How many people tried to contact me after we moved? I asked. For the first time that evening his answer did not come immediately. The pause was small, almost invisible, but after everything I had learned tonight it felt louder than any spoken words. I noticed the pause immediately. It was small, only a few seconds, but after everything that had surfaced tonight it felt impossible to ignore. Daniel had always been quick with answers. He was the kind of man who could explain any situation with calm confidence, the kind of man people trusted in boardrooms and meetings because he never seemed uncertain. Yet now he stood very still, as if measuring the exact weight of the question I had just asked. How many people tried to contact me after we moved? The music continued drifting through the ballroom, soft and distant, while Daniel slowly exhaled. Margaret, he said finally, you are remembering a time when our lives were changing very quickly. There were many conversations, many decisions. Not every detail is worth revisiting after so many years. His voice was steady, but the answer moved around the question instead of through it. I felt something inside me settle with quiet clarity. For decades I had accepted his explanations because they sounded reasonable. Tonight I was hearing something different. Avoidance does not sound the same as truth when you are listening carefully. Richard was watching the exchange closely. That sounds like more than one person, he said calmly. Daniel turned toward him with a faint, polite smile that did not quite reach his eyes. People often become curious when someone leaves a small town, he replied. That is normal. I considered his words for a moment. Curious. The word felt strangely gentle for what it now seemed to represent. Letters returned unopened. Phone calls filtered away. Old friends who never heard from me again. Did any of them speak to me? I asked quietly. Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead he glanced briefly toward the far side of the ballroom where several members of the hospital board were standing near the stage, discussing the evening's upcoming announcements. It was the kind of quick look someone makes when they wish a conversation would simply end on its own. But the silence between us had already grown too large to ignore. Margaret, he said at last, lowering his voice slightly, those people belong to a chapter of your life that had already closed. I believed it was better for you to focus on the future we were building together. I listened carefully to the way he framed the sentence. Not once did he say that I had chosen to close that chapter myself. Richard spoke again, his tone thoughtful rather than accusing. You keep describing what you believed was best for her, he said. But I have not heard you say what Margaret actually asked for. The room felt very still for a moment after that. Daniel looked at him, then slowly turned his attention back to me. For the first time since the evening began, the confident ease in his posture seemed slightly diminished. Not gone, just quieter, more measured. I folded my hands again, feeling the steady rhythm of my breathing return. Something inside me had shifted tonight in a way that could not easily be undone. For years I had believed my life followed a simple path from one choice to the next. Now I was beginning to understand that some of those choices might never have been offered to me at all. I met Daniel's eyes calmly. When we left Willow Street, I said slowly, I thought we were starting a new life together. I paused, letting the words settle between us before finishing the thought that had finally become impossible to ignore. But now I am beginning to wonder if the life we started was one that only you designed. I held Daniel's gaze after my words settled between us. For a long moment neither of us spoke. The quiet around our small circle felt strangely separate from the rest of the ballroom, where conversations and soft laughter continued as if the evening had not shifted in any way. Daniel finally straightened his shoulders slightly, the familiar calm returning to his expression. It was the same composed look I had seen countless times during business dinners, charity events, and formal meetings. He had always known how to appear unshaken. Margaret, he said gently, you are looking at the past through a lens that did not exist when those decisions were made. At that time we were young and life was uncertain. I believed stability was the most important gift I could offer you. I listened carefully to his words. Stability. It was a word he had used many times throughout our marriage. A stable home. A stable future. A stable reputation in the community. And it was true that our life had appeared exactly that way from the outside. We lived in a quiet neighborhood lined with tall maple trees. Our house overlooked a small park where families walked their dogs in the evenings. Daniel built a respected career in hospital administration, and I spent years organizing charity drives, hosting community luncheons, and supporting the events that surrounded his professional world. To everyone watching, it had always looked like a calm and well-arranged life. Yet tonight I was beginning to understand that stability can sometimes be another word for something else entirely. Richard spoke again, his tone thoughtful but steady. Stability is valuable, he said. But stability usually grows stronger when it is built on honesty. Daniel's eyes shifted briefly toward him. You believe honesty is simple because you are not responsible for the consequences of those choices, he replied. Richard did not react defensively. Instead, he folded his hands calmly. I believe people deserve the chance to choose their own consequences, he said. I felt those words settle deeply inside me. Choose their own consequences. The phrase echoed softly in my mind. For most of my adult life, I had trusted Daniel to guide the direction of our shared future. I believed that partnership meant leaning on someone else's judgment when life felt uncertain. But partnership also requires something else. It requires trust that both voices are present when decisions are made. I looked at Daniel quietly. Did you ever consider that I might have wanted to decide for myself? I asked. His expression remained controlled, but I noticed a faint tension along the line of his jaw. It was the smallest change, but after decades beside him I had learned to recognize the signals he tried not to show. Margaret, he said slowly, the life we built together gave you comfort, respect, and security. I believed those things mattered more than reopening doors that might have led to regret. The sentence sounded thoughtful, almost protective, but the meaning behind it was becoming clearer with every passing moment. He had not simply guided our future. He had quietly decided which parts of my past were allowed to exist within it. Richard looked at me then, his expression patient and sincere. Margaret, he said softly, no matter what happened years ago, you still have the right to ask every question that was never answered. I felt a calm clarity settle inside my chest. For most of my life I had accepted silence where questions once existed. Tonight that silence no longer felt necessary. I looked back at Daniel with steady eyes. Then perhaps it is time we begin opening some of those doors, I said quietly. And for the first time since the evening began, I realized that whatever answers waited on the other side might finally belong to me.